introduce our speaker. We will open with remarks by Professor Maki Umemura, Senior Lecturer in International Business at Cardiff University, where she teaches international management and Asian management systems. Her research addresses the evolution of industries at the technological frontier, particularly in biomedicine. Next, we will hear from Professor Jessica Levy, Assistant Professor of History at Purchase College, SUNY, where she teaches courses on the history of race and racism, the history of capitalism, and the US and the world. Professor Levy is currently writing her first book, Black Power Incorporated, a transnational history of Black empowerment politics since World War II. And she's also the host of Who Makes Sense, a history of capitalism podcast. Professor Jeff Jones will be next. He is the Isidor Straus Professor of Business History at Harvard Business School and the co-editor of the Business History Review. He has published extensively on the history of global business, and more recently has been focused on the history of ecological and social responsibility with a special focus on emerging markets. And we will end with remarks by Professor Heidi Tworek, who is Associate Professor of International History and Public Policy at the University of British Columbia and co-editor of the Journal of Global History. She's Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and her most recent book, News from Germany, received the Ralph Gomory Prize from the Business History Conference. And now, please welcome Professor Umemura, whose talk is entitled Enhancing Business History Connections in the Post-COVID Era, Methodologies and Public Engagement. Professor Umemura, welcome.
Can you see my slides? That's great. Okay. So hello, thank you for coming. The title of my presentation today is Enhancing Business History Connections in the Post-COVID Era, Methodologies and Public Engagement. A few weeks ago, I was asked to comment on my reflection on the place and the role of business history during the pandemic and what exciting new agendas, challenges, and opportunities might exist for business historians in the post-COVID era. And I was quite honored to be asked to do so. I was also quite surprised that someone had noticed my work, but I also had been surprised because I thought of myself as someone who walks the boundary of business history as I conduct my research. For those of you who don't know me, just a brief bio. I grew up in the United States because my father was managing the expansion of the Japanese company's operations as the Japanese economy was growing. But we went back as the Japanese economies went down. I went to a Japanese high school and then followed by a history degree at a liberal arts college in the United States. And then I did an economics history degree in London and found a job at a management school in the UK. And I introduced that just as a means of contextualization. I know that some of my colleagues here will talk about themes or subject areas, but for me, as a scholar trained in history, employed at a British management school, and as someone who's gone from place to place from a young age and the mother of two young children, the hows of research are often at the forefront of my mind more than the whats. And so that's true whether I'm trying to make my research a bit more meaningful or interesting to my colleagues, or try to contribute to my school's public value agenda, which is trying to generate social value, or trying to juggle homeschooling and research during the pandemic. Oops. So I introduce this slide here because I think it takes us back a little bit to where we were during the pandemic. And I think for many academics, we recall that we were in lockdown, we couldn't go outside unless it was for an hour's exercise a day or shopping for essentials, not to mention flying for fieldwork. Archives and museums and libraries were shut, and potential interviewees often had different priorities, even if you could technically talk to them on Zoom. So I think many colleagues, given the pandemic restrictions, at least temporarily, switched to projects that involved non-archival research or stall their research projects for a while as they kind of preoccupied themselves with caring duties. But I think it also encouraged many of people to make their research a little bit more meaningful for society, conducting university research to society through public engagement and impact. The pandemic also highlighted the interconnections with the world, not only because the virus traveled so quickly across countries and shut down previously open borders, but also because the acceleration of digital migration and communications. And I think whilst the former highlighted the importance of international research, I think the latter facilitated the formation of connections that could help collaborative research across borders. So in this presentation, I will talk about two interrelated things that I thought were important to the place and role of business history in the post-pandemic era. And the first was enhancing public engagement and impact, so connecting academic research to society. And the second, increasing collaborations for international and interdisciplinary research, so connecting across places and disciplines. And as some of the researchers and presenters in this session already demonstrate, a good number of business historians are already engaged in connecting their research beyond the academic community through a variety of means. And these include things like advising museums or the production, acting as consultants to documentary films, or delivering podcasts, publishing popular publications, and delivering public talks. I was asked to refer to my practice. So prior to the pandemic, I hadn't done a lot of public engagement myself, apart from a few interesting conferences and scientific conferences, and contributing to organizations like the EU-Japan Center for Industrial Collaborations before Brexit. But I think that a lot of people, I became a little bit more interested in making impact during the pandemic and began to publish in more practitioner journals and policy-oriented publications. So in my case, I was working on topics like advanced therapies, like cell and gene therapies, and I began to publish in practitioner journals to reach scientific communities and policy reports. So in my case, these were publications like Regenerative Medicine or Open Access Government, and my colleagues and I are planning a publication in a scientific journal. I think one of the things that's often talked about also these days is sustainability. And we've noticed a lot of companies talking about how they operate more sustainability to respond to climate change. And I think academic researchers too are talking a lot more about sustainability in their research topics. But I think it's also important the discussions that involve around how we conduct our research more sustainability. So my university, for example, has an environmental sustainability strategy that involves becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And what that means for my colleagues is that the university will support 1 European travel per year and 1 extra European travel per year. And that has implications on how my colleagues and I will be able to conduct research and how they engage with other scholars around the world. So my next point is connecting across borders. And I think that there is a wealth of diverse locations across continents, evidenced by article publications in the Business History Review, Enterprise and Society, and Business History. I think that the Business History Journal now has a call for papers out on exploring business histories of Middle East and North Africa. And I think whilst the English language literature is focused, has a lot on United States and Britain, it already has all of these different localities. I think that if you look into the local languages, you see a wealth of research on business history all around the world. And whilst a minority, a good number of business histories are also comparative. And I think that the contextualization that these studies offer, acknowledging the similarities as well as the differences of historical experiences, are important for reinforcing connections across regions and advancing the field. So in addition to forming connections across borders, the pandemic experience with cross-sectoral collaboration, for example, has underlined the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration to address common challenges. And I think that there's a lot of business historians already located outside of history departments, like in economics departments, management schools, science and technology studies departments. And they have published their works across journals, across disciplines. And I guess because of my interest in biomedicine, I noticed, for example, the works of people like like Nicholas Rasmussen and Laura Marks, who publish across these different disciplinary journals and mass media and applying their work. And applying such historical approaches across disciplines not only highlights the importance of business history, but also allows for new opportunities to shed insights into the work of business history. And I was noticing recent works by Ahisano, for example, who was publishing works in journals of food design to American studies, and how her recent articles with her co-author in business history was incorporating new insights or popular insights of category, core category studies in her article on wine. So I think that these approaches really enrich the field. So what have I been doing? As I was asked to refer to my work, as a scholar working in the history of biomedical industries, I was interested in looking at whether there are more opportunities to apply my work into the healthcare sector. A few years ago, I published an article in Business History on the topic of regenerative medicine and the problem of fit. While I hadn't really explicitly incorporated sociological concepts, the topic of novel technological adoption and fit with existing social technical systems was something that had been discussed in the existing literature in sociology and science and technology studies. So I was then able to collaborate with some colleagues similarly interested in regenerative medicine and the challenges of fit. And rather than my earlier project looking at how did this situation come to be, what we created was a project that looked at how to create a system that would fit regenerative medicine. So we were looking at the readiness for technological adoption, and not only looking at levels of technological readiness, but also institutional, organizational, and system level readiness. So that is to say, we're not looking just at whether cell and gene therapies are safe and effective. We're looking at whether hospital systems or hospitals as organizations have appropriately trained staff, appropriate facilities, and then at the system levels, looking at whether you have insurance systems, regulatory system, pricing mechanisms, logistics systems able to deliver these types of therapies. And that's the bottom right corner shows some of the kind of projects that we were aligned with. So I think that in this context, the digital transformation in communications has made it much easier to outsource or combine fieldwork and facilitate collaboration to conduct comparative or interdisciplinary research. And just before I wrap up, I note another piece of research that I was doing during the pandemic. I was able to collaborate with a German scholar who had archival material on the German and US solar energy industry. He was a historian by training who'd become an interdisciplinary scholar working primarily in sociology and innovation studies. And he and I were both interested in the role of expectations in shaping industry trajectories. So we combined our historical sources, wrote about 3 historical episodes on the expectations in the solar energy sector that would inform innovation policy, and then published our work in a social science journal on energy research, kind of targeted to people who are interested in energy research and policymakers. And the thing about this project, though, was that it was really done exclusively on Zoom. I actually have never met my counterpart, Timur Ergin, in person. So I think that, well, I hope that in this talk, I've been able to note my reflections on the place and the role of business history. I think it's important to value the extraordinary rich historical scholarship that's been enabled by his traditional approaches. And I reflect back to when I was, let's see here. Oh, okay, I have 5 minutes left. When I reflect back to when I was an undergraduate and I'd initially planned to become a microbiology major, but I went to the university archives. I took a few history courses, and I really found it broadening my perspective of the world. And as an international student from Japan, intending to major in science, his switch to history was not entirely pragmatic because I did not think in English, and all of these books were very big and they were in English, and essay writing took at least 3 times longer because I would write them by hand in Japanese, and then I would translate them into English by hand because I did not know the keyboard layout, and I had to punch them into something called Corel WordPerfect at the time. So I was just really taken with the field. So I hope today's talk is not taken as something that kind of overrides existing approaches or anything like that. I just believe that in reflection of the pandemic, there is space for new business histories that make more connections across places, disciplines, and beyond academia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maki. Next, we will hear from Jessica Levy, and she will talk about reconnecting during the pandemic on being human and inclusivity in business history.
Hi, thank you, Justine, and thank you to all the coordinating committee for putting this together. It's so nice to see some familiar faces, as well as names in the chat, as well as those that some unfamiliar ones, and to meet you virtually. So my name, as mentioned, is Jessica Levy, and I'm an assistant professor at Purchase College, where I focus broadly on the intersections between race, business, and American politics, both domestically and abroad in the late 20th century. And I'm currently at work on my first book entitled Black Power, Inc., which is a history that seeks to bring together two stories that are often told separately: the rise and fall of the global Black Power movement, and the post-war expansion of American capitalism, particularly looking at US corporations in Africa, and seeks to probe those interconnections between those two stories. So that's a little bit about my scholarship, and I will talk more about my scholarship throughout this presentation. But my presentation today, in kind of reflecting on the state of business history during the pandemic and looking both back and forward, is also a sort of a personal biography. And so kind of along those lines, I first attended the Business History Conference in 2015 as a graduate student. And one of the first things I remember about that conference were the people that I met, the people that I encountered, and feeling very welcome. It was also an exciting conference because John Lithgow was in attendance, for those of you that were in the Miami conference. And I think, one of the things, in addition to, the scholarship, and I, like Maki, came into business history in some sense as an outsider. I started graduate school very interested in political and social movements, particularly the civil rights movement, and kind of came to business history later. But one of the things that has kept me coming back year after year, in addition, to the tremendous work that is being produced, is also the people that I met. And so when I think about the pandemic, I often think about the BHC, and that's because I was in attendance in the last in-person meeting that the Business History Conference had in Charlotte when everything was shut down. And I actually want to use the 2020 BHC meeting as a kind of point of departure for my comments today, which, and to do so, I seek to touch on kind of three interrelated issues, which Justine mentioned. One is the issue of inequality, both racial and gender inequities as they relate to the field of business history. I also want to spend some time talking about transnational business histories and the importance of international research, and the both challenges that the pandemic has posed in terms of doing such work, as well as some opportunities. And also, to a lesser extent, talk a little bit about the experiences of junior scholars at this time. So with that, let me begin. I want to start with the question of race and business. The relationship between race and racism and business was, in short, what initially got me interested in business history, where I sought to probe the role that entrepreneurship had played in the development of Black politics, and vice versa, the role that racial politics have played in business, American business, particularly in the history of the corporation. Such questions have led to my engagement with the rich and dynamic field of Black business history in particular. At the beginning of the 2020 annual meeting, when I first arrived in Charlotte, I arrived for a workshop entitled New Directions in African American Business History that was organized by Shanette Garrett Scott and Brandon Winfred. And what that workshop, as well as other presentations at the Business History Conference over the years, have really undergirded for me is the vibrancy and dynamism of the field of Black business history at the moment, building on foundational works by scholars like Julia E.K. Walker and Robert Weems, We have seen kind of a plethora of scholarship on Black business history, examining the role, for example, of Black entrepreneurship during the Great Migration, the intersections of food, race, and capitalism in Philadelphia's Black catering trade, the entrepreneurial practices of enslaved people in the antebellum South, and Black women in finance, just to name a few of the kind of exciting work that is coming out or has recently come out. Notably, a significant portion of the work I just mentioned is being done by Black women scholars, Black women business historians like Kendra Boyd, Danya Pilgrim, Jeanette Garrett Scott, Justene Hill Edwards, and Marcia Chatelain. And this, I think, is a really exciting development in the field of business history, and one that I think the organization has been very supportive of. But I think we should obviously continue to be making space, right, not just for Black business history, but for Black business historians as well. As we do that, I think one of my thoughts on this is that it's important that we avoid the tendency, which has been present in the discipline's own history and is obviously present in the field more broadly, to construct barriers between Black business history and business history more broadly, and rather to constantly interrogate the relationship between these two. And this is a point I made in my most recent article published in Enterprise and Society during the pandemic, titled "Black Power in the Boardroom." And the scholarly intervention of that article is in some sense to look at the role that the Black Power movement gave in giving shape not just to Black entrepreneurship, and there's a wealth of scholarship kind of looking at the role of entrepreneurship in the Black freedom struggle, but also to other movements, other developments within the broader field of business history, specifically the movement for corporate social responsibility. And so this article does that through looking particularly at the lives of various Black activist entrepreneurs like Reverend Leon Sullivan, who in 1971 became the first Black director of General Motors. His appointment came on the heels of protests at GM, citing particularly the lack of Black managers and directors, and in some sense, symbolizes this intersection between social movements and corporate management. Once appointed as a General Motors director, Sullivan then continued his activism within the company, advocating for various programs to support Black mechanics, include job training. And he later drew on this experience to develop what were known as the Sullivan Principles, a corporate code of conduct that are actually cited in many business history textbooks as kind of one of the first major international coordinated efforts to promote corporate social responsibility, particularly focused on those corporations involved in South Africa. So here and elsewhere, my work seeks to uncover some of the seemingly strange partnerships forged by Black activists and US multinational corporations amid the various debates surrounding racial injustice and corporate social responsibility that animated both the Black Power movement and later the anti-apartheid movement. And it was actually the latter, the focus on kind of US corporations and the anti-apartheid movement, which I was supposed to present on at the 2020 Business History Conference. And yet, in what I'm sure might be a familiar experience to those in the audience, the pandemic interfered with my plans. So to just kind of take you back to that conference, I remember, being in the hallways of the hotel and receiving an email first from a fellow panelist who, was very apologetic and apologized, but noted that due to underlying health conditions and kind of the growing information coming out about COVID-19, that she was unfortunately not going to be able to make the conference. And this was followed by a flurry of communication, both emails and text messages from my other two panelists, who up until the day before the conference intended to attend in person, and yet ultimately both decided against taking that risk. Now, in their cases, they, like so many scholars, forced to make decisions during the early stages of the pandemic with little information to guide them, had not just their own health, to consider and whether to make the meeting, but also their families. Both of these colleagues had small children. And I bring up this moment because it underlines for me, I think a really important lesson from the pandemic, and one that I hope we as business historians will keep in mind as we look forward, to a potential future post-pandemic or new normal, whatever you want to call it these days. And that is this, that, many of us are familiar with the stories regarding the ways the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities in society, exposing people, the most vulnerable populations, particularly Black and Brown communities who comprise a significant share of healthcare, food service, and other essential workers to increased risk. The pandemic has had a particularly, effect on Black business as a Black business historian, which comprises, a significant portion of small businesses that have really struggled. And yet I think, we haven't always paid attention to the pandemic's effect on us as academics, including as, business historians. It is true that, many of us, myself included, have spent the pandemic in the relatively safe space of a home office or work office. In my case, during the early stages of the pandemic, my living room. And yeah, that's not the case for everyone. And one of the consequences of the pandemic is that it has created new challenges for particular people, some of whom are members of this community of business historians. So, on that note, I wanted to tell a brief story about an exchange I had with a colleague recently, a fellow business history member. I had made the mistake of asking them how their semester was going, which is a loaded question in normal times, but particularly during a global pandemic when nearly all educators are at our wits' ends, juggling the demands of Zoom teaching, dealing with sick students, enforcing university COVID policies on top of this usual workload. On top of these various concerns, this colleague was facing additional stress of teaching in a location where the governor had declared mask mandates and vaccines prohibited, thus leaving my friend to face nearly certainty of contracting COVID, which was particularly scary for them because they had 2 kids under the age of 12 who were unvaccinated at home. And recently, their youngest child, not even 4, had been sent home from daycare yet again due to an outbreak at the school. Now, while horrific, this story is in some sense not unordinary anymore. Indeed, I've heard, many similar stories from colleagues across the country. And, I think, one of the things that has raised me is, the importance of thinking about our own humanity, right? Our own, the limitations of, before we are business historians, in many ways, we are people, we are human with all of the societal baggage and societal obligations that are, come attached to that. And in order for business history to thrive, in order for business history to be inclusive for all scholars, including those with families, those with physical and mental health conditions, those suffering the trauma of racialized policing, those struggling to pay rent because their institutions don't, pay a living wage. We have to find ways to support the individuals that are behind the research, right, that help to sustain our field. So, this is one of, I think, the big kind of takeaways for me from the pandemic is kind of, in some sense, if, scholarly conversations prior to the pandemic, business historians are really great at situating business in society, thinking about our interactions between the corporation and politics and various cultural developments. The pandemic has really, focused on thinking about how we as business historians are also embedded in these various societal networks, societal developments, and that those, various inequalities that shape our society also to shape our field, and to really undergird, that before scholars, we are human individuals, and that has presented various limits. And kind of on that note, on my last few remaining minutes, I want to talk about another development and kind of the limits, of being human and also trying to be a business historian in relation to transnational research. And I hope to kind of, point to some of the opportunities I think we have for human connections, but also scholarly connections in the future. So in the summer of 2020, I was scheduled and had received funding to go to South Africa, where I previously spent over a year doing research on US corporations there during apartheid. And yet, of course, as familiar experience, the pandemic got in the way. And as a junior scholar in particular, one of the challenges that I have faced is moving around different institutions a lot. So at the time I was at the University of Virginia, but I was set to start my new position at Purchase, and some of the grant funding that I had received to do this project, I worried that I was going to no longer have access to. And so thus, sort of faced the challenge that I think, many grant recipients are familiar with which is, use it or lose it. And so it was almost kind of, by compulsion that I was forced to kind of rethink my research methodologies. Instead of going to the archive myself, I hired a South African research assistant who was able to gain access to these archives for me. And this, I think points, in some sense, I think one of the lessons I hope to take away in terms of thinking about doing transnational research. We are, as historians, often kind of, pushed to do our work individually to complete our archival, work. There is something, very special about being in the archive. And yet, in some sense, the pandemic has forced us to look for new collaborations, which I think offer a real opportunity, particularly in thinking about doing international research. One of the advantages I had from hiring this research assistant was not just that actually he was a local and was able to get into certain institutions that I would have not been able to due to pandemic restrictions that basically only allow people affiliated with particular institutions into archives. Many of those restrictions are still in place, particularly in countries with high numbers of COVID transmission at the moment. But I also gained access to his wealth of information as somebody who had been in South Africa for over 10 years engaged in historical research. In other words, he didn't just do the archival research I asked him, he came back with new questions and new insights that have really helped to animate my own work. And so I think, looking forward and thinking about, transnational business research, which I think is, an important topic and an important direction for business historians, we need to really think about collaborative opportunities of working with scholars, across the world, and not just because we have to, but because it produces better scholarship. So I'm getting the 1 minute mark, so I'm going to wrap up my comments there, but I look forward to talking more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for your really insightful comments. All right, so next we are transitioning to Jeff Jones, and his comments will focus on business history and sustainability.
And I've got a note saying host disabled participant screen sharing. So can I screen?
Sure, I'll change that 1 second. All right, you should have access now.
Let me fumble around for a few minutes. Ah, there we go. Can anybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I want to begin, stating the obvious, then talking a little bit about my research, and then wrap up within hopefully less than 15 minutes. And I'm just attempting to move my... So let me begin by stating the obvious. The obvious is the world is unsustainable. On all current trends, by the end of this century, it may be unlivable. And I think COVID has made it very clear as well that this level of sustainability rests on wider social unsustainabilities of inequalities. Inequalities within societies, inequalities between societies. Now, the thing is, for saying that, business is at the heart of this problem. It is business which has been the fundamental agent of destroying the natural environment. Some people may say that's an overstatement and say we also have failed policies. We do have failed policies. But a surprising number of those policies are themselves the result of business lobbying. And if we go through the other inequalities in the world, business is right at the center of them. Now, why say that obvious statement? I think it shows how important business history is. It may be the single most important discipline in explaining how we arrived at such an unfair and unsustainable world. Now, it's possible, having said that, that maybe business history can't help because we have a very strong, primarily, but not entirely US-based literature, which has been telling us basically that capitalism just doesn't work. I put some of the most important, to me, works there, but we have a very intense documentation of how business has helped undermine the environment, how it's manipulated policymakers. And we can go on from that to business's role in various other social catastrophes that we currently live in. So it is maybe a non-subject. I don't think it is, because I think that business historians have shown that that's really a gross exaggeration. I'm particularly happy to talk about this subject because it means it's not an ego trip for me, because I was in no way a pioneer of this area about sustainability. In the United States, Chris Rosen was going on about this importance of this subject 25 years ago in Europe. And Christian Bergquist and her colleagues have been writing strongly about it over quite a long period. My own work is a latecomer to this. But the big problem is how little work there is in this area. So business history, you can count on, maybe there's 10 people, maybe less, business historians who've written substantially on business and the natural environment. And yet business has been the agent of destroying the natural environment. The literature then is hopelessly biased away from what should be the central issue, I think, of business history research. And that's the problem. Well, I don't want to be, one of those people who tell other people what to do. So let me talk in a few minutes about what I've been trying to do and try to continue. I increasingly became convinced that ecological issues had to be embedded in broader social contexts. So one way I've gone at that is my forthcoming book is try to look at what I call deeply responsible business leaders over the last 150 years, to see what they did, see what responsibility means. And to put it there, I've been asking questions like, well, what's it mean? Is it a good thing? If it is a good thing, why did it never become mainstream? As in all my work, I believe passionately, as does I think the last two speakers, the importance of comparative research. So these are some of the characters I'm dealing with. And I trace their stories, I integrate their stories into an evolving picture of people who attempted to be far more responsible as leaders of for-profit businesses than most of their peers, and explore what they did, why they didn't become mainstream or whatever. You can see some of those images. Another one of my things is that I believe business history has totally got to grow out of just talking about Europe and the United States. And so I integrate stories from people in other geographies into this story, and they are as central to the story as people based in Europe or the United States. Let me give you a couple of examples. One, Edward Ph.D. had to do him because he's in Boston. Each of my guys or women face a huge problem. His problem was he was horrified, like many people in the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century, by inequality of wealth and of access. And he sets about trying to do things about that. He does the usual paternalism stuff, but that was common to the whole sector. But he goes a lot further. He tries to give away ownership of his firm because he thinks that's the only way to seriously address inequality. And then he seeks to use his reputation and his funds, not only within his firm, but to enhance communities. He tries unsuccessfully to make Boston a little less corrupt than it was. More seriously, he really bankrolls and leads the creation of the credit union movement, which is enormously important in providing access to finance for people. And towards the end of his career, he's been horrified by fake news and the growth of racism, anti-Semitism. And he actually sets up an institute to fight fake news. None of that brought him any benefits at all. And that's, what I think of a responsible business leader. My second example is Egyptian, Abu Ibrahim. His problem was in Egypt, the poverty of the people and the poverty of the soil destroyed by the applications of modern agriculture. And he sets about doing something about that. He creates basically, he makes the desert bloom through using biodynamic methods, generates income by selling biodynamic crops to affluent consumers in Europe, plows the money back into schools, hospitals, and a university, creating a virtuous circle of responsibility. So it's the kind of people I've been writing about. And, just what do I pick out of that? In 10 minutes, you can't say very much, but I do see across geographies and across time periods, certain common features of these people, the industries they choose, their ability to work with other stakeholders, their investment in community, which I think is tremendously important. I see them driven by common values. I call them virtuous and spiritual. These businesses were overwhelmingly closely held family companies. And I think above all, we see that all these, generalizations about capitalism being inherently wicked or selfish are wholly misleading. There is in fact a heterogeneity in capitalism, which business historians should be, and hopefully are, constantly highlighting. So why didn't these guys become mainstream? In management, there's a lot of literature that being good is also profitable. History doesn't support that at all. Being responsible, being sustainable always costs more than the opposite. And it was very, very difficult to compete with conventional firms. Anyone who goes into a public company is the kiss of death, for deep responsibility. And quite clearly, globalization since the 1980s has made it even harder. Although we've had a globalization of the rhetoric of sustainability, most of it is basically fake news. And it includes certainly ESG investing hugely in that category. So let me end by pulling that a little bit together. And here I pick up what Maki said. Pandemic, the pandemic has convinced me even more that academics have a responsibility to society. That responsibility takes different form in different disciplines. But for business historians, the responsibility is quite substantial, because the role of business in making the world so unsustainable has been so great. We have a real need, I think, to deal with that subject much more centrally. We have a real need to share that knowledge. I think that's very important too. Much of the work that has been done on green business would discredit much of the work that's done in management departments on green business, for example. We have a duty to share it, to move things on. And we have a duty to share it far more widely to the wider community. I think that's quite hard, because my take on the academic profession is that writing about big issues, using unconventional sources, doing comparative research, reaching out, is often not highly prized by the people by referees, by the people who make appointments, by promotion committees. And that's a huge problem. I think the academic discipline, academic world is a huge obstacle to doing really radical things. But I do believe that if business historians deepen and really focus on saying research relevant to the real world, we'll get the students, we'll get the jobs, and we'll make the impact, not fake impact factors, but real impact. And as citizens of the 21st century in a world that's unsustainable, I think we have the obligation to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, Jeff. And we will be transitioning to our final speaker, Heidi Tworek, where she will be talking about business history and health. So Heidi, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you to my previous three presenters, who I hope have set me up actually quite well to talk about business and health. For those of you who know me, you might be wondering, where is the communications history? But I promise you by the end of this presentation, we will get to some communications history and a bit of an explanation as to why now I spent the last year thinking about the history of health, and particularly perhaps following up on what Jeff has said, doing a lot of public communications around COVID communications. So one of the things I've done over the last year and a half was work with a big international team to write a report about COVID communications in 9 countries around the world, including Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Senegal, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Canada, but doing so informed in historical ways. And yet that focused quite a lot on governments and on civil society. And one of the other things that I was doing as a co-editor of the Journal of Global History, we were probably the first major journal to do a pandemic special issue. So we curated 11 articles about pandemics that changed the world. But this presentation in many ways is a mea culpa for all of those activities, because none of them really involved business history. None of the 11 articles in the Journal of Global History focused on the role of business in pandemics. When I've been talking to the media, only once have I been given the opportunity to talk about business at all. And yet the same has been true in the other people who have written about pandemics in history. When we think about the sorts of popular articles, you might open The Guardian and read Laura Spinney talking about the flu pandemic. We've seen plenty of other historians write about everything from the history of conceptions of air all the way through to the massive inequalities we see in prior pandemics. But once again, we've seen relatively little business history, when in fact, I would argue that the business history is crucial to understand the structural conditions of our current pandemic. So I don't have a time to trace all of the ways in which that is true. So I want to highlight just three to really point out that I think we've been missing out on the business history of pandemics, in part because we've focused so much on public health and because we haven't had the media interest. So I'm going to focus on just three elements where I think we already have a substantial amount of research. We still need more, but we have quite a substantial body of research already that tells us about this history. We simply need to find ways to think about, as Jeff pointed out, how do we bring this to broader audiences? Who are those audiences? And I'm half in a public policy school, thinking about how do we bring this evidence to policymakers as well, because I think it should be informing their decisions in all sorts of important ways. So I'm going to talk about three. The first, the most obvious to people perhaps, is the role of multinational pharmaceutical companies. Second, the role of healthcare systems. And third, the role of philanthropies. So that much of what we see as international organizations or public health is in fact funded by philanthropies, who of course are funded by big business. So the one time that I was able to discuss business history in any of my media appearances talking about COVID communications was when Pfizer was finally approved by the FDA and released its name, Community. And this is the first time that the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, wanted to ask me about the business history of communications. And yet, of course, business history has been everywhere. These companies have been everywhere in the moment we are in the pandemic, why we are in the moment we are in, and how it is unfolding. What is also clear, though, is that despite the novelty, the comparative novelty of mRNA vaccines, despite the comparative novelty of BioNTech, almost all of the companies that are involved, as people like Paloma Fernandez Perez have pointed out, are in fact predating World War II. And many of them, their internationalization predated that as well, whether Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, which obviously partnered with BioNTech. Most of these companies, of course, have a much longer history, one where we can trace why they began internationalizing at a certain point. How do we get to the moment that we are in today? So Fernandez Perez points out in a chapter of 2019 that business historians should be studying healthcare corporations. So I'll read out this quotation because I think it's actually incredibly powerful. Whether life-saving champions, speculators, or criminals, healthcare companies and business groups are business organizations, and therefore have diverse and changing structures and strategies. These structures and strategies both function for individual companies and for the industry as a whole through powerful oligopolies, interest groups, and lobbies. As such, healthcare corporations can be studied by business historians. And remembering that this was written in 2019, I think so much of what Fernandez Perez says here resonates much more deeply with all of us in 2021 after the 2 years that we have just lived through. And it reminds us that there is plenty of research that's already out there, but I think more that can be done to look at the role of business, whether it is in lobbying around restrictions of travel or in prior pandemics, or trying to tease out some of the things that we now understand. To give one very obvious example, we cannot understand the role of where we are today in what some term, frankly, a vaccine apartheid, to go back to Jessica's research, without understanding the history of business and intellectual property and oligopolistic lobbying around specifically the TRIPS waiver. So this is a snapshot from February of 2021. In red were the number of countries who at that point opposed a waiver of many of the patents on vaccines. In May of 2021, the Biden administration, under considerable public pressure, changed its stance, and yet we still haven't gotten that far with it. But of course, to understand how we got to this point, there's a much longer history going back to at least the 1880s and the development of the international trademark, patent, and copyright regimes that we still exist within. Regimes that were created in a very unequal world, and regimes that were created in a moment when one of the only independent decolonized countries that could show up at these conferences, Haiti, was denied its request to the British and the French to make scientific publications free of copyright so that Haiti could catch up. So when you read the Berne Convention minutes, you read many of the structural conditions that lead us to this moment in 2021. And that, I think, is a truly important business history that we should be bringing to the table. The second part of what I think we have perhaps underestimated is the historical importance of healthcare systems. Of course, this is obvious to all of us that the healthcare system we live in has affected how we experience the pandemic. But there are incredible business historians at the BHC who've been writing about the business history of what seem like public health questions, whether it's Pierre-Yves Donzy, who's written about that for Japan, that's the book on the left, or Christy Ford Chapin, who's written about that for the United States. And I think I'll just pick the United States as an example, because I think then business history provides us with a very different explanation of how we've ended up in the position we are in today, or at least the United States finds itself in today. Classic example of how we explain this today is through politics. We want to explain vaccination rates. This is the graph that we see. We see counties that voted for Biden, more people vaccinated than in counties that voted for Trump. But when I was thinking about this presentation, and I was thinking about Christy Ford Chapin's work, I started to delve a little deeper. And I discovered that the group that is least likely to be vaccinated in the United States is the uninsured. And what that says to me is that actually so much of what we need to understand about this pandemic is a business history of how we got to this point. And that's where Christy Ford Chapin's work, for example, is so crucial, which also then brings us to questions of inequality. Who is uninsured? That it's more Black, brown, racialized people within the United States. And yet at the same time, there is the world of people who have a much more public healthcare system, whether it's veterans or in fact some indigenous groups in the United States who have much higher rates of vaccination. My point here is simply that the history of healthcare systems matters. That business history provides some alternative explanations for how we've gotten to points we've gotten to today, the United States being a primary example where politics has been the major lens through which vaccination is understood. And yet I would argue this graph tells us that business history is crucial as well. And then finally, a third aspect where business historians, I think, are crucial and can contribute real insights into what is new about this pandemic and what perhaps is not. Obviously, throughout this pandemic, Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation have been both a place of intense conspiracy theory, but also a place of huge funding. Bill Gates himself has also been a key driver in pushing against vaccine waivers because he does not believe that they will be effective. And often in comments on the Gates Foundation, one of the main things you will hear is that it is unprecedented in its power, unprecedented in the amount of money that it donates to the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization by May of 2020 was receiving more funding from the Gates Foundation than from the United States government. And yet, if we look at the history of American philanthropy, we find that in a weird way, the Gates Foundation takes us back to the beginning of international organizations and public health. Because in fact, the first major international public health organization, the League of Nations Health Organization, was mostly funded by another American foundation, namely the Rockefeller Foundation. So Rockefeller Foundation is founded in 1913. It begins by working on hookworm in the United States South, spreads into Latin America. After World War I, when the League of Nations Health Organization is created, the Rockefeller Foundation becomes deeply interested in using that as a vehicle to fund its particular vision of how public health should be propagated. And so it provides the major source of funding towards the League of Nations Health Organization. So despite the US not being a member of the League of Nations, in fact, one of the organizations that, from my perspective as a now historian of health, one of the most important organizations is in fact funded very similarly to the ways that the WHO was funded by the Gates Foundations. There's a much longer history of the way in which international public health organizations are steered by and influenced by the funding of American philanthropies. So just briefly to explain a little bit about the League of Nations Health Organization. So it does a whole host of things that includes creating all sorts of standardization around medicine, everything from classifications of death to vitamins. It creates national health infrastructures in a huge number of countries, ranging from Greece to China to Bolivia, coordinates epidemic response and scientific studies. The thing that's most interesting to me as a historian of communications, and where I stumbled on this topic in the first place, now nearly 5 years ago, was that the League of Nations Health Organization was primarily invested in communications and information. Because its founder, a Polish man called Ludwig Reichmann, had come to believe that you could prove the value of international health organizations by gathering statistics and information, sending them out swiftly. Ideally, you'd use new technologies like wireless, so you would send that information faster than goods and people could travel. So you could allow health officials to enact quarantines or whatever else was necessary to prevent an epidemic from ever breaking out. And some of those priorities, the focus on statistics, were also things that came due to the reliance on Rockefeller Foundation funding. And this was particularly true after the Great Depression, because the initial idea was that the Rockefeller Foundation would fund for a certain period of time, and then national governments would take over. But with the Great Depression, this no longer became possible. And so the League of Nations Health Organization had to continually lobby essentially for Rockefeller Foundation funding, doing the sorts of work that made most sense to the Rockefeller Foundation, creating the statistics that made most sense to them, investigating diseases that perhaps made most sense, creating a certain set of priorities, which involved looking at very 19th century diseases like cholera, smallpox, and plague. It involved focus on places like Asia, which were deemed to be quote unquote origins of disease. So in the 19th century, cholera was often known as Asiatic cholera in very problematic fashion. So this system focused a lot on Asia, and prejudices that of course seem sadly familiar to us during this pandemic. Now, this system might seem very far away and long ago, but in fact, it helps to explain a lot of how the WHO still communicates. So a lot of the ways in which reports were produced actually created the foundation for a lot of how the WHO still thinks today, with that longer history going back to American philanthropy. So I'll just give you one very basic example, which is simple to see through visuals, through the way in which communications around pandemics were created. And I think it shows you the narrowing of the imaginations around how we communicate around pandemics and what it should look like, what statistics should be collected, and so on. So this is one of the first weekly epidemiological records that was created by the League of Nations Health Organization in 1926. So you can see here are tables of numbers looking at these three diseases, so deciding these were more important than, say, malaria, etc., because these were ones that would have inhibited trade. So we see here another aspect of business history. One column in English, one column in French. After World War II, when the League of Nations Health Organization is dissolved, World Health Organization is created, many of the same figures will go on to found the World Health Organization. One man in his Lancet obituary is called the soul of the WHO, and he helped to create the League's communication system. And in 1946, when all of this is handed over, there's an editorial at the top here, which says, very busy times. We want to redesign this publication and rethink what we're doing. We don't have time right now, we'll get back to it. And like all of us with a to-do list, sometimes some items fall off the bottom, and this rearrangement and rethinking of what statistics and communication should be was one of them. So even by the time we get to, this is an example from 2016, this publication looks remarkably similar. 2 columns, French, English, similar sorts of tables around disease, same kinds of conceptualizations of what disease should be and how one should measure it. The only difference is now there are multiple colors in the fonts. And this, I think, starts to tell us a lot about the imagination of how we've seen this pandemic. Why have we been so obsessed with comparative statistics, even as those statistics have often obscured as governments, businesses, et cetera, have fudged those statistics? But why are we obsessed with them? In part, it's because of a disciplining that came through the League of Nations in the 1920s and 1930s to collect this sort of thing, influenced by the Rockefeller Foundation. So these are just 3 ways, I think, in which business history gives us a new view of the pandemic. It pushes us to think about it in a slightly different way than we have been. We've been thinking about it through the lens of government for all sorts of, I think, important reasons, through public health. But in fact, there are many business stories and business history stories that lie behind it, ones that tell us about reasons for structural inequalities, whether within countries, but also very much between them, why we are in perhaps the situation with vaccines that we are. And I think what we do as business historians is we point out what is structural. And here we see, when did these things emerge and why did they emerge as they did? So I think mea culpa as business history has plenty to offer, and I look forward to discussing that with all of you in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And again, thank you, Jeff and Jessica and Maki for your insightful and incisive comments. And we are going to open the floor for Q&A. But to get everyone started, I'm going to actually pose a question. And that is, can you talk a little bit about how you've adapted your research or how your research has shifted or responded to not only the global pandemic, but the global racial justice protests, especially over the last 2 summers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can start if others are okay with that. Thanks, Justine, and what wonderful presentations by everyone. Obviously, I think in some sense, my work was already animated by questions of race and racial injustice prior to kind of recent upheavals of following George Floyd's murder. But I think there have been several kind of things over the last year, in some sense, and this speaks to kind of my broader approach to business history more broadly, which I didn't talk about in my earlier presentation, which, one has to do with archives and the voices, right? That, who's included in business history, who are we looking to? For anyone who, familiar with my work, my kind of business histories tend to focus on, particular Black voices in particular, and that's had a lot to do with the archives that I've gone to. I've engaged with kind of more traditional corporate archives, archives of General Motors and others. But one of my kind of strategies for, understanding the relationship between business and racial injustice is, in some sense, to look at both the activists that were protesting various corporations. So I do this in, the 1960s and 70s, but also those Black executives who were appointed to corporate boards or as corporate executives in waves after these protests. And I've learned a lot from this that I think is directly applicable to this moment. So, we've seen kind of in response to the various protests, various, companies coming out with programs to support communities, statements about, anti-racism at their, kind of adopting much of the rhetoric and the slogans of the, recent Black Lives Matter movement. And my own research, kind of points to the fact that has a lot of precedent. Corporations and businesses, much of the kind of racial integration of the 60s and 70s was in direct response to kind of Black Power movements, in that moment. And, it's not a simple story, I think, to kind of to mention, to kind of to Jeff's comments about, the relationships of kind of business responsibility. It's not, a simple story that, all the, executives, business were kind of opposed to racial injustice. There were changes made. You can, trace that in the statistics, of the numbers of Black, managers being appointed in the 1970s. But there is also an appropriation that I think is important to pay attention to in the ways that businesses have historically, at least, responded to various Black protest movements. And I think we can see going on now, and that's important to kind of think about. What changes are more rhetorical, what changes are meaningful that go beyond simply, hiring one person and have a broader effect on the kind of structure of racial inequality in this country, and the world, I should say.
Great, thank you. Heidi, Maki, or Jeff, would you like to take a stab at the question, either in terms of how your research has shifted, or perhaps how your research questions have shifted because of the pandemic or global racial justice protests?
Maybe I'll take a sort of side stab at this, because I also got tenure during the during the pandemic. So I've thought a lot about what does that mean, but it was a very weird moment. And I'd say that one of the things that I've tried to think about is, what do you do with that power? The power that is tenure. And I think one of the things that we can do is to share. And that is to, instead of having research assistants who are not your co-authors, those are the sorts of things where we can make a very big difference. Who do we bring on as research assistants, and do we make them our co-authors rather than just thanking people in a footnote? And those are some ways in which we elevate people and we give them chances, and we ensure that we have a greater diversity of voices in academia, even if that will be the one thing that people write before they go off and do something else. So I think this can be one, certainly for historians who tend to be lone creatures, and in the other disciplines where I roam as well, alongside business history and management, places like communications or political science, it's very normal to co-author. And so this, at least for me, has been something that I've thought a lot about, because I think it's a way that we can try and push against some of these hierarchies, is to really think about what does it mean to do research with people, and what can we do to make sure that there's a greater justice, and that has to come from the people who have the greater power. It cannot come from the people who have less power. So that's, I think, one way that we can try and rethink some of these collaborations, and those of us who do have tenure and the luxury of doing that, to say, when do we make sure that we try to make people co-authors and not have what can be ultimately potentially exploitative relationships.
Okay, I guess I will just add to that. I guess my response to upheavals and about social and racial injustice was to make my research a little bit more meaningful to society, as I mentioned in my presentation. And I sort of piggyback on what Heidi was saying in terms of collaborating with people who can actually give a voice, because I kind of thought about this in relation to the Japanese context, and I personally didn't think that I could really write a justifiable history about the Ainu people, or even underclass peoples. And I think that collaborations is a good way to give authentic voice to those histories that remain underwritten. And I certainly think that digital communications really facilitates that, even if you're just, for example, looking at single mothers in Tokyo who are working on a Ph.D. project and have really brilliant insights to offer, but couldn't do so before. Thanks.
I'm coming at it from a slightly different place, because everything I do is global rather than domestic. So some of the changes I've done are in the MBA classroom. For example, I'm just about to teach a new case I developed on, well, the richest ethnic Chinese in the United States, but the case is based around the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, that in that case, in my current teaching plan, about halfway through, I'm going to ask, why are white Americans why do they so afraid of Chinese and so discriminatory against them? So I'm going to go right into that issue of what's been happening to Asians on the streets. And generally in my MBA class, I've been constantly evolving the population of characters. Still got some works to go, but we have, I think I'm quite proud of the level of diversity we have. I mean, the other thing I do is I run a very large oral history project on emerging markets, which Andrea was very important. And so we have been continuing to collect the stories, the lengthy stories of entrepreneurs throughout Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and Asia, and make those publicly available. So we hope, we're putting into public domain lots of very important stories about people who are not white people, to put it crudely, for people to use in their teaching and in their research. And the pandemic's been a bit of a technical issue for us in that respect, because people don't particularly want to have a camera crew and faculty in there. But we developed a hybrid model now, so we've figured out how to leave. Anyway, so we've managed, and we've in recent months done a Moroccan, a South African, a couple of Nigerians. So we're picking ourselves up despite the challenges.
Thank you for those responses. And I think, Dan, you have a question.
Yeah, and the panelists started to actually kind of get at some of these issues already. I think Heidi's response in particular started to address them, but I have kind of two interrelated set of issues. One is many of you guys talked about ways in which, we've individually or in small groups started to kind of change patterns of behavior and collaboration forced by the pandemic. And at the same time, others have mentioned the global scale of some of the questions we need to ask about inequality, about health, about the environment, which in some ways, the combination of those things confront us as a community and the practices we've traditionally held. I mean, it is called the Business History Conference, a reference back to a single event held in person one time a year, where individuals come and present their research. So I guess the question, and I think this is a fabulous example of the kind of different patterns that we can kind of engage in thanks to kind of Paula's sort of initiative and Andrea's initiative. But what are some other things you think that we as a community need to do to kind of change the way in which scholarship is produced? And maybe also one other thing which hasn't been touched, the way in which teaching is produced, given the fact that, speaking of, institutions in crisis, you could argue that that's another part of our mission as scholars that, we really ought to grapple with as a community. Not all at once, please.
I can. Let me do some, well, other people are thinking something sensible to say. Let me do some self-promotion. Our journal, Business History Review, have just introduced a new slot called Perspectives, which is published published along with the normal articles, but we are not going to put them through the normal refereeing process. And the aim of that is to enable people to write things in which they feel strongly about on a more ambitious scale, which would get shot down by referees. So, I mean, I think I said in my presentation, I think maybe less in business history than some other disciplines, journals are a huge obstacle to doing anything very innovative. And you know that in the management field, it's like a total nightmare if you deviate from the accepted methodology or language of any particular journal. You just cannot break out of the mold. Luckily, business history isn't completely trapped like that. But I mean, that's one thing we've done, and we've run a couple of articles already, and we want to encourage more articles, people thinking boldly about something they would really think is important, and yet didn't think they can get it through the referees. And we'll take any subject, actually. So anyway, that's my piece of self-promotion. I'll pass on to.
I'll jump in and just to say another project which I didn't mention have been working on over the pandemic, and in some sense, I think the kind of pandemic has given me the space to think more about kind of collaborative work. So for a while, I'd been in discussion with a colleague kind of about rethinking the story of kind of global American business after World War II, wanting to integrate more, thinking about US multinational corporations engaging particularly in the decolonizing world. And this, had come from our own, research, me working on South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, and then working in various places and related to oil. And at one point, we realized, and perhaps precisely what Jeff is saying, that our ideas were too big for a journal article, that the traditional kind of methodologies of the discipline would not endorse this project. And so we've embarked on a co-edited volume, which is still, I think, is not a new development, right? But in terms of thinking about tenure and acceptability, right, is still, there's a question mark there. But it's been a really exciting project, and it's allowed, we're just focusing on American companies, but we really are kind of trying to make the project global in scope, and it's allowed for us to bring people working on various different parts of the world together. And we've been able to do so in part because we can come together on Zoom and share workshop things together. So I do think there is room for collaborative work, especially in trying to do this kind of comparative global business history. In fact, it's necessary, right, in order to do that kind of rich archival work. We all can't be specialists in different places, and there's a lot to learn. I have a lot to learn from scholars looking at U.S. businesses in Asia, in other places, Latin America, that has really helped to inform my own scholarship.
Yeah, maybe I'll give a practical example, which I think the BHC is already engaged in. But once the pandemic was clear it would be around for a while, a group of us who work on social media platforms. So I was the only historian and everybody else was more in communications, political science, etc. We decided to create a global platform governance research network. And we involved 15 institutions who were based in every continent except Australasia, and 25 individuals basically from every continent. And we just pulled this thing together. I'm still not quite sure how we did it. And we had 2 research days and we had 1 network day, which we ran twice so we could cover every time zone in the world. And we did a survey of everybody who wanted to come to the conference so we could get a sense of what are your priorities, where are you based, etc. And then for the network day, what we did was we had 1 person from each group, each of the 2 time zones, record a short video based on the survey saying, this is what people want, but this is who we have. So we could have conversations about what does diversity mean in this space, but it was based really on who is participating. And so I think and this sparked a whole host of really interesting conversations, because one of the things that historians or people working on social media platforms are very interested in is archives, because social media platforms use the term archive to describe things like ad archive, but it looks absolutely nothing like what a historian thinks is an archive. So I was the only historian there, so we started having incredibly interesting conversations about these questions. Well, how does a historian define an archive? What should this look like? What does an archive look like in other places? And one of the communication scholars, who's called Christian Katzenbach, who's located in Bremen, has started to build what he calls a platform governance archive. And what this is basically trying to be the first place to actually document when social media platforms change their terms of service. Because when they change them, you don't know unless a newspaper reports on it. Because sometimes it's a small change, big change. So, and most of that just disappears from the web unless the Internet Archives happens to crawl at the right time. So, Katzenbach is basically doing a historian's work about the present. And I think there's all sorts of interesting things like that, but it's also a corporate archive in all sorts of ways. So it's not quite answering your question, Dan, but I think it shows us that we can use this moment to involve a whole host of different institutions and to stand something up in new and ambitious ways. If we reach out to people in multiple different locations, they could be very interested in it. There are ways of overcoming all sorts of things, including time zone challenges. But there are also a whole host of scholars in different disciplines where each of us, depending on what we're doing, could actually find that they often are deeply interested in what we as historians are doing. We just need to go and be in that space, whatever it is for us. And it's actually very important because in these discussions about ad archives, platform governance archives, some of this starts to get cemented in law, things like ad archives. So the definition of an archive becomes actually pretty crucial. And if you have no historians in the room, it turns out to be a very flawed definition. So I think we can also think about using the business history conference as a global space, but also where do we go out to offer our insights into these questions.
So I guess it's my turn, and I think I'd like to address the question of how teaching is produced. And I think that some of the issues are already covered, but I think that you can, use these advances in digital technologies to incorporate guest teaching, for example, about places from different places around the world, from different scholars, from different disciplines. I think the challenge for me moving to online teaching is how to make these in a very short engaging sessions, because students' attention span just don't last that long. Or can we encourage group work involving digital archives that can relate to topics of grand challenges that students might be interested in. But that's kind of my initial stab at the question. It's not a comprehensive answer, but that's my stab at your question.
Thank you, everybody. Just a very quick reaction. It really does feel like, you know, the BHC in some ways is a platform, right? It's a very engaged community already. And if we can leverage some of this moment in time and some of the technology to find each other in richer and different ways, I think it would be really cool.
Yeah, and speaking of engaged community, we do actually, in the time that y'all have been answering these questions, we do have some questions from the audience. True to form, we have a two-parter from Phil Scranton, which I will actually ask both at once so that you can be fully overwhelmed. I think all three of these questions, I don't know if you can actually see them, but all three of these questions, they might not require a response from everyone. So it's okay to pass if you feel like you don't have a fully fleshed out response, and hopefully we'll get a few more as well. So, so thank you, first of all, Phil, for your questions. So given that this meeting is addressing rethinking agendas, I'm curious about a broader set of questions concerning business and crises. How do enterprises recognize a non-economic crisis? Do they plan and prepare for such events? And if so, when and where? What can we learn from errors in business practice regarding natural, political, or health upheavals? So the sort of central question there is, what do we do about non-economic crises? Because we as business historians think a lot about economic crises. The second part of this question is, this seems an appropriate time to think about the history of business profiteering, given the vast increases in wealth among top echelon business persons and firms, even as COVID-19 wrecked lives and incomes of middling and lower classes. And I really like this sort of comparison to war profiteering. War profiteering has been studied a bit, but we can learn about efforts by states and communities to curtail business efforts to sort of take advantage of suffering or inequality. All right, so that was like a multi-complicated question, but who wants to go? Who wants to take a stab at that?
I can speak a little bit to that. Thanks, Phil, for your question. You know, I'll specifically talk, I think, about racial crises, because that's, you know, my own research, and leave health and natural crises, I guess, to the other panelists. You know, in my experience studying kind of corporations' responses to, in some sense, you know, historically thinking about it, kind of a series of crises, and I think that's kind of this, you know, interesting that they did not foresee, you know, what we know now in terms of, you know, the 60s and the kind of Black Power movement, which is, you know, then followed by kind of other, you know, quote unquote racial crises on a global scale, including decolonization and apartheid. In my experience, you know, many of the corporations that I study were very slow to respond, right, to acknowledge the crises, particularly in the case of apartheid. To, you know, acknowledge that these were issues that they had to address, until the point of, if we, you know, talk about, you know, racial crises in some sense being sparked by, you know, activists and sparked by, you know, Black people and others kind of demanding change, right, until they were, you know, entering shareholder meetings, right, and basically interrupting the business itself, right, until the normal going on of business is interrupted, or, you know, to kind of cite Marcia Chatelain's work on McDonald's, right, until you know, riots were literally burning down you know, McDonald's stores, is when McDonald's kind of, okay, something's going on that we need to address. But you know, the other thing I think that kind of gestures a little bit to the kind of profiteering is that, you know, businesses, corporations often look for opportunities, right, in those crises, and this is something, you know, we're all familiar with, and those, you know, I think those opportunities are again kind of complex. It's not not a simple, you know, how do they profit? In some sense, I think, you know, when we think about business's innovation, you know, I've found these various moments of racial crisis to be incredible for kind of corporate innovations in terms of thinking about how to profit, right? Moments of, okay, how do we, you know, if initially it's a kind of corporations are responding, for example, in apartheid to, you know, growing demands for sanctions and divestment, are very resistant to, you know, acknowledging that this is something they need to address. They end up being quite innovative in finding ways to profit actually in multiple forms, either finding ways around the legal restrictions of divestment and sanction through licensing agreements. Many corporations remain, continue to profit in South Africa even after they've quote unquote divested, but they also find new ways of profiting through, for example, highlighting kind of their commitment to fighting anti-apartheid to boost their brand. Coca-Cola is really, for those of you, I don't know if you can see the background, I have a Coca-Cola collection here. Brilliant in terms of advertising, changing their company's image from one that protesters are kind of Coke sweetens apartheid, Coca-Cola being a synonymous with racial oppression. To the early 90s, they end up partnering with the ANC and Nelson Mandela to kind of portray themselves as partners in building a new South Africa. And they distribute Coke bottles with Nelson Mandela's image all over it, kind of equating. So I think there's an incredible innovation that comes with crises.
Maybe I'll just say something briefly, which is, yes, the question about war profiteering is excellent. And I could well foresee, and I think don't yet have enough histories to delve into that question during prior pandemics, partly because historians of medicine and those who've written about them have focused, as I've said, on other things. Hence why we ended up with the Journal of Global History pandemic special that focused on very different aspects of pandemics. And I think there are many histories still to be written. In general, when businesses are included, it's much more about trade between places, so shipping companies, etc. But I suspect there's much more if we start delving into this. A couple of other things that come to mind is, of course, safety crises, all types of safety crises. People like Zach Froelich who work on food safety standards. We already have some historians who think about this, but these are, I think, other types of crises. Some others, another obvious one that has been written about by journalists is the opioid crisis, the Sacklers, one which I think dovetails in many ways with Jessica's Coca-Cola story, because so much of the success is about advertising. And it's about how you advertise towards doctors and so on. So I think those are some of the other aspects for business historians to delve into. I think there's a lot of space in the history of medicine for business historians, and I'm excited to see, there's already a body of work, but I'm excited to see these two things come together, because I think there could be a lot of really fruitful exchange from bringing much more business history into history of health and medicine.
So I think I will address fairly briefly the first questions on non-economic crises, and I think that I think that in relation to things like natural disasters, like the earthquake or nuclear disasters, or healthcare tragedies, I think piggybacking on what Heidi was saying, but I think that there are themes that can be explored. I don't entirely have a good response to the conditions at which companies recognize that kind of non-economic crisis. But I think that through exploring these types of themes that we can come up with a better answer. Thank you.
So profiteering, I think one of the greatest scandals at the moment is how large corporations pay relatively little tax and move their money around different offshore centers. And honestly, I don't think I've seen any serious business history studies on exactly that. And yet it's actually like sitting in the archives of companies, what they're doing. If you can, get to grips with some of the accounting data and the story of how firms learn to avoid taxation and use these offshore financial centers is, I think, is a hugely important, and it's a monstrous example of profiteering at the very heart of the modern business system, actually. So I think that'd be a great research topic for somebody.
All right, so we've concluded that if you submit a panel on profiteering to the BHC 2022, there's a really good chance people will be interested in this. Great. The next question is also actually to Jeff Jones. Could you reflect a bit on the importance of what business historians teach in relation to the issues you raise? So I think the question here is sort of like, what are the implications for teaching for your findings and for the research agenda that you propose?
Well, one challenge answering that question is I don't know what people are teaching. I've got some idea about what people are researching, but what actually people are teaching is a bit of a vague. My intuition is that people tend to cling on to traditional stories because there's a lot more literature on them. So if you want to do, rise of big business or whatever, all that sort of stuff, or trains or something, I think there's a kind of an implicit assumption from many business historians that you'll do that, and the literature is all there. And the more exotic you want to get, if you want to incorporate a lot of stuff about the environment, for example, or a lot of stuff about business and inequality, you start scratching around for this stuff, which is a huge problem, right? So I think that's my rather incoherent answer to that as a profession, we need to get more literature, more accessible literature in the domain so people can use that material for their teaching. I mean, I feel it's, in my own classroom, my responsibility to relate history to the present and to go through issues, of racial justice, social justice, and other things. It's probably easier for me because I'm dealing with MBAs who are anyway interested in the present day. I haven't signed up to do a history course anyway, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that question of teaching is really contingent on what kinds of students you have and what the way the classes are framed, which I think all of us who have taught various forms of business history classes know that it can vary quite widely. That's the end of the audience questions. Sometimes what can be really helpful in these panels is to give the panelists an opportunity to sort of talk across and speak to one another, particularly given that there's been a lot of sort of common themes and synergies across these presentations. So if that would be of interest, if you have things you want to say, or we can continue talking about profiteering because that seems to be a theme in the chat. Whoever wants to weigh in, or I think I might have more questions in the email.
So I guess one sort of theme that did come up was this question of professional incentives. And so I'm sort of thinking about what is the role of a place like the BHC in intervening in that, in really because I think it is a tremendous problem, but it's also a big, at least in some Canadian institutions, a bigger discussion around how we gatekeep the profession, that in fact, in order to really have a more diverse profession, you need to have a broader vision of what is scholarship. And yet, once you hire in and people go up through the tenure chain, that becomes very hard to sustain. So I wonder, I'd be curious, Jeff, about your thoughts as to how do we actually get there? I think a lot of people want to change these incentives, but where do you think the push has to come from? Is it from these scholarly societies? Is it everybody pushing within their own institution? How do we actually do something about this perennial problem?
Well, I think first of all, we recognize that it is a huge problem, actually. Within each individual institution has its own story. So I think it behoves people in the institutions to step out of their comfort zones and try to get changes. And that can involve, brave decisions, supporting a younger colleague who needs protecting against, people trying to push them around. Being prepared to say things that take people out of their comfort zone. So I think, individuals have a lot of responsibility. Societies, can do things. They can award prizes, for example, which can be one important, I think, incentive. Establish particular sessions where something is going to be discussed every year, which is another good idea. Organize events like this of various kinds of networking, and all of those things I think can push things on a little bit. But the roadblocks, as I keep going on about, the roadblocks to change, I think are strong. That's a huge problem which we need to recognize. I think once you're tenured, you have a great deal more responsibility to try and open the path. Really, that's with tenure is very nice, but I think it carries responsibility to try and make a difference and not fall asleep.
I think to add to that, I think that university school leaders can play quite an influential role. I think that I witnessed quite a bit of change at my organization when the means of evaluations for staff were switched from the rankings of specific journals to just eradicating evaluation and promotions based on what was then ABS What Star. I think that the school has made a decision not to refer to any kind of stars or impact factors in evaluating professional promotions. They've introduced something called public value. So they're supposed to be a public value business school. They want staff to really make an impact on society. And so trying to incorporate that into evaluation performance. And when you apply for your promotion, that kind of alleviates the pressure to publish in specific types of journals and make a greater public impact, I think. So I've seen a kind of cultural shift at my organization under our current and previous leadership.
I think in terms of thinking about the BHC, and I'm, probably I think the newest member of the BHC on the panel. So, most of my experiences come from when I was still a graduate school. And I think, in terms of inclusivity, I actually have found the BHC to be, very proactive in terms of, what Geoff was saying about, focusing on particular panels, right? Kind of the awards distributions, but also the financial incentives to younger scholars. We know, all the statistics, about, students of color, right? Women often having less, personal wealth to attend, just to attend conferences, right? That was something I noticed about BHC very early on, was the support that it gave to graduate students, which I think was very meaningful in terms of people's ability to be part of this community. But I think also in terms of thinking about incentives, right? I actually think there are incredible incentives for an organization like the BHC to increasingly, put an emphasis on inclusivity in terms of thinking about the future of our field, right? If we don't, you all hear the stories, graduate students, right, kind of, not making it, right, not making it to the tenure track, in order to maintain, going back to my point in my presentation about us being, humans before scholars, right, before we can even do historical work, we need to be in the room. And there is a lot of, I think, incentives for the organization to continue both financially supporting junior scholars and scholars from diverse backgrounds and fields to being here in terms of sustaining the field. You know, I've been thinking about, even though I am not a parent, right, but as you noticed by my comments, right, thinking about the very difficulty that young parents and all parents have had during the pandemic, and our ability to return to any kind of in-person conference, right, really depends on, in some sense, childcare, you know, being something that's going to be a kind of requirement for particular individuals, many individuals, to kind of continue engaging, you know, with the BHC, but also other organizations.
That might actually be a perfect point to end it on. I know that I don't think everyone has had a chance to weigh in on that thought, but in the interest of making it a 110-minute Zoom instead of a 120-minute Zoom, let me just underline the please don't forget about the contingent folks working outside the professoriate and outside the tenure track, particularly people who finished in 2020 and 21. It's been rough out there. But anyway, I want to thank all the panelists and especially the organizer, or I don't know, maybe I'm not supposed to do this, but I'll do it since I'm talking, for especially everyone who organized this mid-year event. I learned a lot, and I hope that all of you who are still on the call have enjoyed it as much as I have. And I'll turn it over back to Paula and Andrea if they have any final thoughts.
Okay, thank you. I'll be very brief. Of course, I want to thank you all for attending to this event, and the panelists. I learned a lot as well. Excellent presentation. I believe we'll have a very fruitful discussion, a lot of challenge ahead. And as Dan have said, I think BHC can be a platform for engaging more potential collaborative efforts. And please let us know if you have any ideas and how to really promote these new agendas in the post-pandemic era. And also I can mention that BHC's trustees is trying to create a more permanent committee on diversity and inclusion as part of our organization in order to promote and engage with this debate. And once again, we are looking forward to continuing all this dialogue at our 2022 conference meeting, hopefully in Mexico. If not, will be Zoom or something hybrid or something in the middle. Let's see what happens. Thank you again. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
What do you think?